The Ministry of Pacification had a perfect record, and Director Vescothren intended to keep it that way. In 400 years of interstellar conquest, the Ministry had processed 41 sapient species. Some had folded in days. The Chlorothi, a hive species with no concept of the individual, broke the moment their queen node was isolated. The Grash, warriors who had never lost a battle in their own recorded history, lasted 3 weeks before their war council signed away their fleet in exchange for the return of 6 hostages. Even the Yashiri, a species so psychologically resilient that ministry analysts had once called them unbreakable, in an internal memo that Vess still kept framed on her office wall as a joke, had cracked in the end. 11 months. A new record at the time. The method never changed because the method never needed to change. You did not break a civilization by burning its cities. Burned cities bred martyrs, and martyrs bred resistance for generations. You broke a civilization by finding the 4 or 5 individuals whose judgment its people trusted most. Its generals, its elders, its negotiators, whoever held the actual decision-making weight, and you took them somewhere quiet. You did not torture them. Torture made heroes. You simply removed everything that made their resolve possible. Certainty, company, meaning, hope, and time to think clearly. You gave them small, false victories to keep them compliant, and small, real defeats to keep them afraid. You let despair do the work that violence never could. Eventually, without fail, one of them would break, and once one broke, the others followed within days, because certainty is contagious and so is its absence. 41 species. 41 confirmed successes. The ministry's methodology had been refined by 4 centuries of use into something closer to a scientific instrument than a policy, and Vescothren, who had personally overseen the last 6 pacifications, had never once seen it fail. Which was why the file sitting on her desk was, at first glance, entirely unremarkable. Species: human, Homo sapiens. Homeworld: designated Sol 3, self-designated Earth. Population: approximately 8 billion. Technological tier: post-industrial, pre-interstellar, notable for extremely rapid development across all fields in the last 2 centuries. Threat assessment: low, pending confirmation. Standard pacification protocol authorized. 4 individuals had been selected from the first contact delegation, not military leaders since the humans had sent none, which the ministry found strange but not alarming, but 4 people the human government had flagged in intercepted communications as figures whose opinions the public actually listens to. A retired combat medic who had spent 11 years in what the humans called war zones. A hospice chaplain who had, according to her file, personally sat with over 4,000 dying strangers. A man on the human justice system's list of the condemned, waiting out his final appeal, who had somehow become a minor celebrity for the calm, almost cheerful letters he wrote from his cell. And a hostage negotiator, retired, whose file noted dryly that she had once talked a man out of detonating a bomb by discussing, at length, his childhood dog. An unusual mix. Not soldiers. Not scientists. Not politicians. Just 4 humans who, in different ways, had spent their lives sitting across from people at the worst moments of their existence. Vess found this mildly interesting from an anthropological standpoint. It did not concern her. The method did not care who the subjects were. It cared about time, isolation, and the slow erosion of certainty, and time, isolation, and erosion did not discriminate by profession. She authorized the standard protocol and did not expect to think about the file again until the first status report arrived in 6 weeks, as it always did with the usual notation. Subject showing expected signs of psychological deterioration. That was not what the first report said. They took the 4 humans in the night, which was standard. Disorientation worked best when the subject's body was already confused about time. Each was placed in an identical cell. 3 meters by 4, a cot, a chair, a single light that never turned off, and a wall panel that would, over the coming weeks, show them carefully curated fragments of a war they were told their species was already losing. The medic's name was Owen Reyes. He was 61 years old, with gray stubble and the particular stillness of a man who had spent a long time in places where sudden movements got people killed. When the panel woke and showed him a starfield, then a burning building that was not, in fact, on Earth but was designed to look enough like one, he watched it for exactly 4 seconds, said, "Huh," and went to sleep. The ministry's monitoring officer, a junior analyst named Doss, flagged this as unusual and logged it as possible shock response. Subject may present delayed reaction. Doss had seen 40 species process the opening despair sequence. Most screamed, or wept, or beat on the walls. A few went catatonic. None had ever simply grunted and gone to sleep. In the cell beside him, Chaplain Marisol Vance sat cross-legged on the cot, looked at the burning building on her screen, and said, out loud to no one, "That's a nice bit of theater. Bit heavy-handed on the color grading, though." Then she closed her eyes and appeared to meditate. Doss flagged this too. The condemned man, Terence Okafor, laughed. Not hysterically. A short, genuine laugh, the kind a person makes at a joke they weren't expecting to find funny. He'd spent the last 6 years of his life on death row appealing a conviction that he maintained, calmly and consistently, was wrong. And in that time he had developed what his letters called a very particular relationship with fear. He looked at the burning building, said, "Y'all are gonna have to do better than a fire," and lay down on the cot with his hands behind his head. The negotiator, Priya Chandrasekaran, did not laugh and did not sleep. She studied the panel with the flat, assessing look of a woman evaluating a threat display, made a small sound of understanding, and then spent the next 2 hours pacing the cell not in distress but in what the monitoring logs, confused, described as apparent methodical exploration of the physical space, unclear purpose. Doss compiled the first day's report and sent it up the chain with a note. Recommend director review personally. Vess reviewed it personally. She read it twice, then a third time, and felt something she had not felt in 4 centuries of overseeing pacifications. Mild irritation, the specific irritation of a technician watching a well-calibrated instrument produce numbers that made no sense. "They're not despairing," she said to Doss. Over the comm, "They're evaluating." "Yes, Director. Continue the protocol as scheduled." This day 1. Even the Yashiri took 3 days to show the expected pattern. "Yes, Director." Vess closed the file. She did not, this time, forget about it. By the end of the 2nd week, the pattern had not corrected itself. If anything, it had gotten stranger. Owen Reyes had begun talking to the wall panel. Not screaming at it, not pleading with it. Talking to it the way a person talks to a radio, commenting on the fabricated news footage as it played. "That explosion's got the wrong sound delay for the distance they're showing," he said once, apparently to himself, and then, "You'd think a species that can cross interstellar space could get their fake shrapnel physics right." Doss began to suspect, and then confirm, that Owen was not being defiant. He genuinely found the manufactured despair footage technically unconvincing, in the specific way of a man who had spent 11 years around real explosions and had simply developed opinions about them. Chaplain Vance had started singing. Quietly, mostly to herself, an old, slow song in a language the translation matrix flagged as archaic devotional, low urgency for translation. When Doss finally had it translated out of curiosity, it turned out to be a song traditionally sung at deathbeds, meant to comfort the dying. Vance was not distressed. She appeared to be practicing. Terence Okafor had begun a routine. He did push-ups against the wall each morning, recited what the monitoring system eventually identified as poetry. His own, apparently, composed and half-remembered from years of solitary confinement, and spent long stretches simply sitting still with his eyes open, in a state the psychoanalysis subroutine flagged, uncertainly, as possible meditative trance, unclear if intentional. It was intentional. Terence had spent 6 years learning how to be alone with his own mind without that mind turning on him. Because the alternative, in a cell on Earth waiting for a date that kept getting appealed and reset, had been unbearable. An alien cell was, structurally, not so different. Priya Chandrasekaran had stopped pacing and started something the ministry had genuinely never seen a captive do before. She began, patiently and methodically, trying to get the guards to talk to her. It should not have worked. Ministry guards were selected for emotional discipline and trained never to engage verbally with pacification subjects, on the theory, for centuries old, never once disproven, that any human contact, even hostile contact, gave the subject something to hold on to. Silence was part of the erosion. It took Priya 9 days to get a guard to answer a question. The question was not about escape or about the war, or about anything the guard had been trained to refuse. It was, "Your posture's different when you're at the end of a long shift versus the start of one." Rough rotation. The guard, a young soldier named Krill who had, in fact, just come off a brutal double shift covering for a sick colleague, said without thinking, "Yes," before he caught himself and went silent again. Priya said nothing else that day. She had what she needed, confirmation that the guards were not android or hive-linked but individual, tired, overworked people, which meant they were, structurally, exactly the kind of subject she had spent 30 years learning to talk to. By the end of week 3, Krill was answering questions most shifts. By the end of week 4, he had started asking 1 or 2 back. Vess found out about this from a report that Doss submitted with visible reluctance, because it violated 4 different protocols at once, and Vess's first reaction was not alarm. It was something closer to fascination, and fascination, in her 400 years of experience, was the single most dangerous emotion a ministry officer could feel toward a pacification subject. Vess convened an emergency review with the ministry's senior analysts, all of whom had, by this point, read the daily logs and reached the same uneasy conclusion she had. "They're not resisting the protocol," said Analyst Threll, an old officer who had overseen the Grash pacification personally. "Resistance we understand. Resistance is defiance, and defiance burns out. This isn't defiance." "What is it, then?" Vess asked. Threll pulled up the footage of Owen critiquing the fake explosion sound design. "It's like they've already processed this. Like the despair sequence isn't landing because the category of thing it's trying to produce, hopelessness, isolation, fear of a slow, meaningless death, isn't new information to them. Look at their files. The medic spent a decade around violent death. The chaplain spent her career sitting with dying strangers. Every day, for years. The condemned man has been formally scheduled to die on and off for 6 years, and has had that date moved 11 times. The negotiator built a career out of walking directly into other people's worst moments and staying calm enough to help them." "You're saying they're desensitized," said a younger analyst. "No," Threll said slowly. "I'm saying they're trained. Not by us. By their own species long before we ever found them. We've spent 4 centuries assuming despair was despair, universal, exploitable, the same weak point in every mind we've ever broken. But these 4 didn't arrive at this cell as blank subjects. They arrived already carrying 4 different, deeply practiced ways of sitting with suffering without being consumed by it. We didn't select 4 ordinary humans, Director. We selected 4 humans whose entire lives were, by pure administrative accident, the single worst possible preparation we could have handed them for surviving this." The room was quiet. "There will be others like them," Threll added. "Statistically, on a planet of 8 billion, this cannot be a coincidence of only 4 people. If this is even partially representative of the species." "It isn't representative," Vess said, more sharply than she intended. "It's a sample of 4. Continue the protocol. Escalate the despair sequence. If 4 unusual individuals can absorb the standard method, we adjust the method." "We do not," she said, looking around the room. "Declare a species unbreakable after 4 weeks. The Yashiri took 11 months. She believed this when she said it. She would keep believing it with gradually decreasing conviction for the next 5 months. The ministry escalated. It always could. The footage grew more specific, more personal, tailored using data pulled from each human's own communications and public records. Fabricated messages, supposedly intercepted, in which their loved ones on Earth expressed doubt, exhaustion, the beginnings of giving up. Owen was shown a message, purportedly from his estranged daughter, questioning whether he'd ever really been there for anyone. Marisol was shown one from a former patient's family, accusing her of having failed them at the end. Terrence was shown a fabricated appeal denial, backdated, making his death sentence on Earth unrelated to any of this, suddenly newly final. Priya was shown fabricated evidence that a hostage she had once successfully saved had, years later, taken his own life anyway, suggesting all her careful, patient work had been for nothing. This was the part of the protocol that had broken the Yashiri. It was designed to attack not survival instinct, which was easy to steel against, but meaning the belief that a person's life or work had mattered. Every species the ministry had ever pacified had, eventually, found that belief impossible to hold on to in total isolation, fed a slow diet of evidence that it was false. Owen looked at the message about his daughter for a long time. Then he said quietly to the empty cell, "That's not her sentence structure. She never uses semicolons. Whoever wrote this doesn't know her." He was right. The ministry's language modeling division had, in fact, used generic syntax templates. It was a small technical failure with an outsized consequence. It told Owen, immediately and with total confidence, that the message was fake, which meant the despair it was built to produce simply had nowhere to land. Marisol cried at hers, genuinely, for almost an hour, because even a fabricated grief still touched something real in her, the accumulated weight of every death she'd ever sat through. But when the tears stopped, she said out loud, mostly to herself, "Grief isn't proof of failure. I know that. I've told 100 people that. It doesn't stop being true just because it's my turn to hear it." She had spent her entire career teaching other people how to survive exactly this feeling. It turned out the lesson worked on the teacher too. Terence stared at his fabricated denial letter for a long time and then, unexpectedly, started laughing again, harder this time, until it turned into something that might have been the beginning of a sob and then wasn't, because he pulled it back, breathing slow and deliberate, a technique he'd built over 6 years of appeal dates that came and went and came again. "I already made my peace with a date on a piece of paper," he said. "Doesn't matter whose paper it is. Already did that math once. Don't gotta do it twice." Priya did not cry, did not laugh. She sat very still with the fabricated news of the hostage's death for almost a full day, and Doss, monitoring, genuinely believed they had finally found the crack. Then, on the second day, Priya said calmly to the empty room, "If that's true, I still did everything I could with what I knew at the time. And if it's not true, and something about the timeline doesn't add up, that report has 3 different reporting dates that don't reconcile. Then it's not true and I'm not going to grieve a lie." She had spotted the inconsistency Owen had spotted in his own message. A small human error in the ministry's fabrication, for centuries of practiced deception undone by the fact that the ministry had never, in 400 years, had to lie convincingly to someone trained to detect exactly this kind of manipulation for a living. Vess reviewed all 4 responses in a single sitting and felt, for the first time in centuries, something uncomfortably close to fear. She did not act on the feeling immediately. Fear, in a ministry officer, was supposed to be diagnostic rather than instructive, a signal to investigate, not a reason to change course. So she ordered one further test, the kind of test the ministry reserved for species whose resilience seemed to defy explanation. A controlled comparison. The 4 subjects in the cells were not anomalies. They were simply 4 people who a 5th cell was prepared, identical in every respect to the other 4, and a 5th subject was brought in, not a human but a Grash war officer captured decades earlier during that species' own pacification and kept, ever since, in a long-term holding facility as a kind of living reference standard. The Grash had broken once, fully, under the standard protocol, and had lived the rest of his long life in a state the ministry psychologists privately called successfully pacified. Compliant, useful, entirely without resistance, and by every measure the ministry cared about, hollow. Vess had him run through an abbreviated version of the same escalation the 4 humans had endured. He lasted 4 days before the old fracture reopened, and he wept and asked in a broken voice what he had done wrong to deserve being made to feel it again. It was, by ministry standards, a completely unremarkable, entirely expected result. It was also, Vess realized as she watched the footage, the first time in 6 months she had seen the protocol actually work the way it was designed to. The contrast was the data point she had been unconsciously waiting for. The Grash officer's collapse was not evidence that the protocol still functioned in general. It was evidence that it had, at some point in his life, decades ago, successfully taught him the one lesson it was built to teach: that despair, once it arrives, cannot be survived without breaking. The 4 humans had simply never needed the lesson taught to them, because, as Threll would later put it more precisely, they had already spent their lives paying that particular tuition, in installments, long before the ministry had ever found their planet. Vess ordered the Grash officer returned to standard housing with an unusually direct note appended to his file, recommending gentler treatment than he had received in years. It was not mercy exactly. It was closer to guilt, an emotion the ministry's own training manuals did not have a formal category for. It was Krill, the young guard, who finally forced the situation into the open, 3 months in. He had been talking to Priya for weeks by then, carefully in violation of every protocol, always when his supervisor was elsewhere, always brief. He told himself it was reconnaissance, gathering information a good soldier might use. He did not, for a long time, admit to himself that it had become something else. The only conversation in his long, exhausting rotation that felt like it was between two people, rather than between a guard and a specimen. One night, after a shift that had gone badly, a supply failure elsewhere in the facility, a superior officer's temper, the low, grinding fatigue of a war that Krill increasingly could not remember the original justification for. He stopped outside Priya's cell and, without meaning to, said, "Does it get better? Being tired like this?" It was not a question about her captivity. It was a question about his life. Priya, who had spent 30 years listening for exactly this kind of question underneath the question someone actually asked, said, "Sometimes, usually not on its own. Usually you have to change something." She did not ask him to let her go. She did not ask him anything at all. She simply talked to him for 9 minutes the way she would have talked to anyone, prisoner or captor, who sounded like they hadn't been asked how they were doing in a very long time. Krill filed no report of the conversation. But he was seen, and the officer who saw him did file a report, and that report reached Vess within the hour. Vess had Krill brought in personally. She expected fear or defensiveness, or the beginnings of the kind of disciplinary problem that 4 centuries of ministry operation had well-established procedures for handling. Instead, Krill said, "I don't think we're doing what we think we're doing, Director. Explain. We're trying to break them by taking away hope, and company, and meaning. But she, the negotiator, she's not holding on to hope. I don't think any of them are. I think they let go of it early on purpose, the way you'd set down something too heavy to carry the whole way. And once you're not holding on to hope, you can't have it taken away from you. We built a machine to remove something they'd already put down." Vess dismissed him and did not discipline him, which surprised the entire facility because she needed to think, and because some small, honest part of her suspected he was right. Threll, given full access to Earth's public communications archive, vast, chaotic, centuries deep, spent 6 weeks doing what the ministry should have done before the pacification ever began. Actually trying to understand the species, rather than simply cataloging its weapons and population figures. What she found unsettled her more than any weapon could have. Humanity, it turned out, had never needed the ministry's arrival to become intimately, repeatedly, generationally familiar with despair. Every culture on the planet, across its entire recorded history, had independently developed elaborate, sophisticated systems, religious, philosophical, medical, communal, whose sole purpose was helping ordinary people survive suffering, loss, and the certain knowledge of their own eventual death without collapsing. Humans had built these systems slowly over tens of thousands of years, refined them through wars and plagues and famines the ministry's own historical models would have called civilization ending, and had, again and again, come out the other side still functioning, still building, still choosing to keep going. Had, through the specific accidents of their careers, become unusually practiced at something every human on the planet already carried, at some baseline level, as part of the ordinary cost of being alive. The knowledge that suffering was not optional and the quiet, stubborn decision to keep going anyway. "We've spent 400 years, Threll told Vess, in the report that finally, fully changed the director's mind, perfecting a method for teaching species something they had never been forced to learn. That suffering is inevitable and control is an illusion, and eventually you have to keep functioning without either. Every species we've broken, we broke because we taught them that lesson faster and harder than their own culture ever had. This species already knew it. We didn't bring them despair, Director. We brought them a familiar problem in an unfamiliar room." She showed Vess one further piece of evidence, almost as an afterthought, though it was the one that stayed with the director longest. It was a record centuries old by human reckoning, of a plague that had swept across a third of the planet's population within a handful of years, killing without warning, without cure, and without any pattern its doctors could then explain. Entire towns had been emptied. Families had buried more children than they raised. And yet the species had not stopped building afterward. It had grieved, buried, argued about the meaning of what had happened for generations, and then it had gone on founding new towns on the same ground where the old ones had emptied out. "They don't survive catastrophe by refusing to feel its weight," Threll said. "They survive it by feeling the weight fully, and then getting up anyway over and over until getting up anyway becomes something closer to instinct than choice. We modeled our entire protocol on species that needed to be taught how small and powerless they were. This species built that lesson into its own history so many times over that it stopped needing an outside teacher centuries ago. By the 6th month, the protocol had formally failed. Vess made the recommendation herself in a report that took her 3 drafts to write, because it required using a phrase that did not exist, as far as she knew, anywhere in 400 years of ministry documentation. Subjects psychologically stable, standard pacification protocol assessed as non-viable. The 4 humans had not merely endured the cells. They had, in their own separate, uncoordinated ways, begun to run them. Owen had taught 2 guards how to play a card game, using a deck he'd made from stripped panel covers and a marker confiscated, then quietly returned from an inattentive junior officer. Marisol had become something the guards would never have admitted to a superior but quietly, individually sought out. Someone to talk to late at night about the things soldiers in a 4th-century war rarely got to say out loud. Terence had started, almost accidentally, running something like informal counseling sessions with prisoners in an adjacent holding block the ministry hadn't intended him to have any contact with at all. A wiring fault, never fixed, had let sound travel between 2 supposedly isolated wings, and Terence, hearing someone weeping through a wall one night, had simply started talking the way he'd once talked to men on his own cell block who were closer to their dates than he was. Priya had, by the 6th month, an informal, ongoing conversation with no fewer than 5 different guards, none of whom she had asked for anything, all of whom had started, in small ways, asking her for something instead. Vess visited the facility in person for the first time in the 6th month. She stood outside Priya's cell, the door slightly ajar now, an informal, unauthorized concession the facility commander had allowed weeks ago and never reported, because it had stopped feeling like a security risk, and watched the negotiator teaching Krill, of all things, a simple breathing technique meant to slow a racing heart before a difficult conversation. "You could have broken out weeks ago," Vess said, finally, stepping into view. "Some of your guards would let you. I've read the reports you thought weren't being filed." Priya looked at her, unsurprised. She had known, for a while, exactly who was watching and how closely. "Where would I go?" she said. "I'm on a planet I don't know how to survive on, for 100 light-years from Earth, in a war I don't fully understand the shape of. Running wouldn't get me home. It would just get me lost somewhere worse." "Then what?" Vess asked, and heard, with some private discomfort, genuine curiosity in her own voice. "Are you doing instead?" Priya considered the question honestly. "The same thing I did for 30 years before you arrived. I'm in a room with someone who's suffering, and I don't have the power to fix the thing that's actually wrong. So I do what's in front of me. I talk. I listen. I try to leave the room slightly better than I found it, because that's the only part of any of this I've ever actually been able to control." Vess was quiet for a long moment. "We built an entire methodology," she said, "on the assumption that removing hope would remove function. You don't seem to require hope to function." "I don't think I do," Priya agreed. "I think I require something smaller, just the next right thing to do. Most days, that's enough." Vess walked the rest of the wing that afternoon, something she had not done in years, preferring reports to rooms. She found Owen teaching his card game to a guard on his off-shift, using slang the translation matrix rendered, unhelpfully, as a string of untranslatable interjections. She found Terence sitting with his back against the shared wall, talking quietly to whoever was on the other side of it. His voice pitched low and even, the cadence of a man who had learned, long before any of this, exactly how much space to leave in a sentence for someone else's silence to fill. She found Marisol asleep, for once peacefully, the wall panel behind her looping footage of a war she had stopped watching weeks ago because, she'd told Doss once, "I've sat with worse than pretend fire. I'd rather rest." None of it looked like a pacification facility anymore. It looked uncomfortably like something closer to a hospice ward that had, through some strange administrative drift, also become a place people wanted, in a limited and specific way, to be. Vess found this the hardest thing to write into any report, because there was no ministry term for it. Every other pacification in 4 centuries had produced silence, eventually, the particular, specific silence of a species that had stopped fighting because it had nothing left to fight with. This facility had grown louder over 6 months, not quieter, filled with card games and half-remembered songs and conversations through a faulty wall. And the silence, when it finally came in the debrief room where Vess sat afterward trying to write the truth down plainly, was hers alone. The debate at High Command lasted 11 days, longer than any policy dispute in ministry memory, and Vess sat through most of it in person, which was itself unusual. Directors of her rank typically submitted reports and let juniors defend them. She defended this one herself. The objections came from several directions at once. Some officers argued the sample was too small to be meaningful. 4 subjects out of 8 billion proved nothing, and a larger, harsher second attempt would surely produce the usual result. Others argued that the guards' reported affection for the subjects was itself evidence of a subtler, more dangerous kind of psychological attack. That the humans had, whether deliberately or not, begun pacifying the ministry rather than the reverse, and that continued contact risked contaminating far more of the fleet than 4 isolated cells ever could. A third faction, quieter and more troubling to Vess, simply refused to believe the report at all, on the grounds that 4 centuries of unbroken success could not be undone by 4 individuals, and that Vess herself must have been compromised somehow, grown soft, gone native, whatever term for failure best suited a species that had never had to invent one for this particular kind of failure before. Vess answered each argument in turn, patiently, the way she had once, long ago, answered questions from junior officers learning the pacification method for the first time. She did not raise her voice. She had learned that from watching Priya without entirely meaning to. "Send a larger team if you want data," she told them. "I will not object to the experiment. I object to the assumption underneath it that if you simply apply enough pressure, for long enough, any mind will eventually give way. That assumption has served us for 400 years because it happened to be tested only against minds that had never needed to develop an answer to it. We have now tested it, however accidentally, against 4 minds that had. It did not merely survive. It began, in 6 months, to change the people applying the pressure instead. I do not know what that tells us about the other 7,999,999,996 of them we have not yet met. I know it should frighten us more than it apparently does. 11 days of argument ended, in the end, not with a vote but with a document. Vess's final report to the Ministry High Command was the most difficult she had produced in her career, not because the conclusion was uncertain, but because it was not. Recommendation: immediate cessation of standard pacification protocol against Sol 3, Earth. Confirmed finding: subject species exhibits pre-existing, culturally embedded psychological resilience frameworks incompatible with the Ministry's despair-based methodology. For subjects, selected without knowledge of this trait, have not merely resisted degradation but have, over 6 months, produced measurable positive psychological effects on Ministry personnel assigned to their containment, a result without precedent in 400 years of Ministry operation. Recommend full strategic reassessment of the human species prior to any further military or diplomatic engagement. Recommend, further, that the 4 subjects be treated not as failed pacification targets but as a warning. If these 4, selected by administrative coincidence rather than deliberate design, could not be broken by our most refined method, the Ministry has no confirmed method for breaking this species at all. High Command did not receive the report well. There were demands for a second team, a harsher protocol, subjects selected more carefully next time. Soldiers, this time, whose psychological profiles could be pre-screened for maximum vulnerability rather than accidentally chosen for maximum resilience. Vess, for the first time in 4 centuries of loyal service, refused a direct order. "You can send a second team," she told High Command, in the recorded session that would later be quietly removed from most official Ministry archives. "And perhaps you'll find 4 humans without whatever accident of history shaped these 4. Perhaps you'll find a set of hostages who break in the ordinary way, and you'll call that proof the method still works, and you'll be wrong because you'll simply have gotten lucky the way we got unlucky. This isn't 4 humans, gentlemen. It's a species-wide capacity we didn't know to look for, distributed unevenly, and impossible to reliably screen out. You are welcome to keep trying. I am done being the officer who tries first and reports the failure after." She was relieved of her post within the week. History, or at least the small, quiet corner of galactic history that concerned itself with the Ministry's one true and total failure, would remember her for it anyway, because the report she filed and refused to soften became the founding document of a policy that no other alien coalition ever managed to walk back from once it began. Humanity was not approached again with despair as a weapon. Every subsequent contact would be built, out of hard necessity, on something the ministry had never once needed to develop in 400 years of unbroken success. Negotiation. Between equals. Owen, Marisol, Terence, and Priya were repatriated 8 months after their capture. Released under the terms of a treaty none of them had been consulted on, and all of them found, on reading it later, faintly amusing in its cautious, almost apologetic language. They did not know each other, not really. 8 months in adjacent, isolated cells is not the same as 8 months of friendship. But they had, in a strange way none of them fully articulated even to themselves, been through the same war without ever meeting the others fighting it. At the small, quiet debrief held before they were finally allowed to go home to their separate lives, someone from Earth's newly formed Office of Interspecies Affairs asked them, almost sheepishly, what had gotten them through it. What the secret was. What extraordinary thing they had done. Owen thought about it for a while, then shrugged. Didn't do anything extraordinary, he said. Just did what I always do when things go bad. Paid attention to what was actually happening instead of what I was scared might happen next. Marisol said, I sat with it. Same as I've sat with 100 people dying in hospice beds. You don't fight grief or fear or an alien with a wall panel full of fake footage. You just sit with it until it's not the only thing in the room anymore. Terence said simply, I already knew how to wait for a date that might never come and keep living anyway. Turns out that skill traveled. Priya said, I think the mistake they made was assuming despair works the same way on everyone. It doesn't. Some people need hope to function. Some people just need the next small task in front of them. I've spent my whole career learning which one I am. Turns out that's a harder thing to take away from someone than an alien empire expected. None of them framed it as a victory. None of them wanted a parade, and Earth, still absorbing the strange, vertiginous fact of its own first contact, didn't quite know how to give them one anyway. There was, however, one small ceremony none of the 4 had asked for and none of them turned down. A private meeting, arranged through channels Earth's new diplomats did not fully understand yet, with the alien officer who had overseen their captivity. Vess arrived without escort, without rank insignia, dressed in something closer to civilian clothing than any of them had ever seen a ministry officer wear. She did not apologize, not exactly. The 4 of them noted, comparing stories afterward over a meal none of them had expected to be sharing, that she seemed constitutionally unable to use the specific words for it, the way some people simply cannot manage certain sentences even when every part of them clearly means to. What she said instead was closer to a confession than an apology. She told them, plainly, that their species had ended her career, and that she did not resent them for it, because in 400 years of loyal, competent service, she had never once been forced to genuinely wonder whether the thing she'd spent her life perfecting was actually true. You didn't defeat the ministry, she told Priya, in the quiet corner of the room where the 2 of them ended up talking longest, an old habit that neither of them commented on. You just made it impossible for me to keep believing what I'd always believed about what happens to a mind under enough pressure. I don't know what to do with a species I can't finish my own sentence about. Most of us don't either, Priya told her. That's sort of the whole trick. You keep going anyway without the finished sentence. Eventually you stop needing one. Vess did not fully understand this. She wrote it down anyway, in a private journal she had never kept before that year, in the small, careful handwriting of someone learning a new habit late in a very long life. But 400 light-years away, in a ministry archive that would, within a decade, be quietly folded into a larger and much more cautious diplomatic corps. A single line from Vess Cothran's final report remained, unread by almost everyone, filed and largely forgotten, except by the handful of officers who would, in the coming years, be the first to approach humanity again, and who made very sure, this time, to read it first. We assumed the only way to conquer a species was to teach it despair. We never considered that some species arrive already having learned, on their own, the much harder lesson of what comes after. Those officers built something new out of that single line, over the following years, slowly, and without much confidence at first, because the ministry had no template for a first contact that didn't begin with a demonstration of force. They opened, instead, with questions. What do you already know about losing something you can't get back? What did you build afterward to keep going? It felt, to the officers assigned to ask them, uncomfortably like admitting weakness before the conversation had even begun. Earth's diplomats, for their part, found the question strange, and then gradually less strange because it turned out to be a conversation humanity had been having with itself in one form or another for as long as it had kept written records. They simply hadn't expected to be having it with someone from another star. Vess never returned to ministry service. She took a small, quiet post instead years later, advising the very diplomatic corps that had grown out of her own disgrace, and she kept, for the rest of her long life, a single framed line of text on the wall of her new, much smaller office. Not the old joke about the Yashiri this time, but the sentence she had once struggled and failed to finish in front of a woman who had spent 30 years learning how to sit with people at the worst moments of their lives. I don't know what to do with a species I can't finish my own sentence about, it read, in her own small, careful handwriting. Beneath it, added later, in a different hand entirely, Priya's, during a visit neither of them ever fully explained to their respective governments. Someone had written a single line back. You don't have to finish it. You just have to keep showing up to the conversation. It was, as far as anyone could tell, the truest thing either species had said to the other in the whole long, strange history of their acquaintance. For 100 years of the ministry's perfect record had ended not with a battle, and not with a surrender, but with 4 ordinary people who had simply refused to stop being who they already were, and with one alien officer watching them do it who found she no longer wanted to be someone who could stand and admire it from the other side of the glass.